And just as importantly, in the midst of this, you have to align this in some way to be responsive to state goals. It's what governors and legislators and others are going to be looking at. You who are on campuses are the experts on the ground. You are in the trenches every day working on these issues. So how do you translate that up into such a way through a funding formula that makes sense at the state level and you can communicate what is being achieved? So really am in unison with you on this front and kind of, taking on this effort. With that said, as far as what we're hearing conversation-wise now, one is that tension between being dynamic and stable, and I'm sure through this you will look for that outcome, but also a tying of these formulas more to student success and student outcomes. How can states address some of their equity concerns? You have your own internal equity concerns within a state, getting at institutional, geographic, and demographic representation, but then beyond that, closing equity gaps as far as outcomes. How might student success measures, as you define them within your context, flow through such a model? And I think it's really important to consider that as you move forward. A well-designed formula will ultimately help with some of these discussions and kind of an actualization of what student success can look like through funding. When I think of our role within this, what we want to do is join alongside of you. Hopefully we can be a phone a friend as needed, but also can help establish kind of guiding principles for this process and what that might look like. We're an outside entity who's kind of examined this at the national level, but how can we help you frame out a process that works best for New Mexico and New Mexicans? And ultimately, that's what's most critical here. We have 50 state systems and structures, and all of them are unique in their own way. And so what works best for you, but through that lens of kind of what we've seen working in other states and the conversations that are taking place. So this uniform process combined with some type of focus on student success and outcomes, I think will get you towards a more dynamic structure moving forward. So with that, I just once again want to thank you for having us join your conversation. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to drop into another conversation, but I know David and Dustin are here with you. And Secretary, if there's anything that we need to discuss on the tail end of today's meeting, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Thank you, President Anderson. We truly appreciate it. So I'll go ahead and let you go. And I kind of want to dive into this meeting immediately, but thank you to each of you for joining our agency today. We have gathered our guiding principles and overall short-term and long-term goals, and we're eager to continue this discussion and begin to plug in scenarios and numbers into the formula through the technical group, which Dr. Rommel will elaborate on later in the meeting today. An overall theme we heard from last meeting was keeping the funding formula simple while utilizing reliable data metrics and clear definitions. We also heard from nearly every single member of the working group that the redistribution of the base causes some unintended inequities amongst New Mexico's higher education institutions. So with that being said, let's dive into our guiding principles today. That conversation will be led by my partners at SHIO, and then I will jump into the discussion of the short-term and long-term goals that we identified from our last meeting. So with that, Vice President Dustin, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you two.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we really appreciate the opportunity, as President Anderson said, to engage with you. One, we just love working with our members on an individual basis, but two, we learn a lot that then we can share with other states as they too take on this challenge of evaluating and making changes to their funding processes. We hold what is now a monthly meeting of the finance officers from across the states. And one of the top issues that they're concerned with is how to evaluate and change their funding formula. And so, like we said last time, you're in good stead. Others are struggling with the same questions. From the last meeting and the conversation we've had with the department before and since that meeting, it appears that you all are landing on what we think is four high-level guiding principles, and at this point in the agenda, we're going to talk through each of them, see if they ring true to you, if there's changes that need to be made to the wording, or could we do without some of them? Should we add any? And hopefully arrive at consensus around the guiding principles, because this is a critical step in the process. If we can't arrive at agreement around the principles, values that are motivating this, it's going to be really hard to find agreement on the actual metrics, how they're weighed, how the money is attached to them. And so we commend the department in regards to the approach they're taking, starting with these principles. I think that's right in line with best practices in evaluating funding formula. And so the first principle, if you have your agenda up, it's reward student success while remaining focused on equity and attainability for all New Mexicans. And this is rooted in kind of two underlying beliefs, right? One is that we want to use the formula to motivate and advance our interest in student success, right? That the idea is money can incentivize and reward institutional policies and practices that improve student success. The second component, like this is almost two principles, is the idea that that money can both improve equity, but it also can make it worse, okay? And if you recall last time we talked about that there is actually a growing body of research that says our past approaches to performance funding have made equity worse. It's worsened things, and that's a hard thing to grapple with, but it's necessary. Would that happen, and has it happened in New Mexico? We don't know for sure, right? But in other states and nationally, we've found that selectivity goes up, representation of Black, Latinx, and low-income students often goes down. And so we're in that quandary of we want to reward outcomes around like completions, but can we do it in a way that doesn't make things actually worse? That both maybe we see overall completions increase, but we also see equity be advanced, okay? And so we'll have to, if those are both two goals, then we're going to have to go from the step of agreement on that principle to ideas of how we can create a model that does both things. And I think there are ways to do that. So I'll pause there. Feedback, questions, ideas around principle one. Any disagreement with it or with what I said, any tweaking to the wording or anything else? Any questions? Yeah, Kathy.
Thank you. I don't have any problem with the wording or the measure that's there. I do, however, think it'd be really helpful to have a better understanding of our baseline around some of the equity issues. I think we intuitively feel like, yeah, this is an issue in a state like New Mexico that we need to be addressing. But to be quite honest, we don't look at the data regularly, and I can't say whether our formula historically, with our focus on increasing the number of awards, has led to an increase in equity issues. We suspect that, and we want to address that, but we don't know that.
Yeah, and we can look at the data and identify equity gaps, right? And those data are out there. Both the department I'm sure has them, and other groups like EdTrust have parsed those data at the state level across the country and shared them to empirically link your past funding formula to those outcomes would require a rather sophisticated research design, and that's been done in other states. I'm just not aware, maybe Dustin knows, if there's been any of that published research looking at New Mexico. I'm not aware of it. And so where we're left is to, I think at this point, because it would take a long time to conduct that study, is to be very aware of where the equity gaps exist in New Mexico and understand that there is the risk, based on what we've observed in other states, that a improperly designed funding formula can have negative externalities that we ought to be concerned about.
So if I can, Kathy, you brought up a very valuable point, and it's how are we linking our data to those successes of our students, and how does that look in the sphere of race and ethnicity, gender, etc. So I think that's definitely a homework point that we need to work on and be better about as an agency in collecting that data and identifying those gaps for our leaders. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. I noticed that we have Mark Saavedra, the director of CUP.
Yes. Hi, good morning and to everyone. A question I have in regards, I agree with Kathy. I mean, in terms of, the wording there, and then of course, we can all work together on the baseline, and it's something I don't think we'll be able to identify, tomorrow or today. So I understand that's probably maybe, so I guess maybe it could be a short part of the short term, more of a longer part of that, right? The question I have for you is other states. So we just got our data from public ed department on graduation rates from last year that have gone up. But something I've noticed is our economically disadvantaged students percentage has been slightly going up or staying around 64% of that population. And so, we have the Martinez-Yazzie case here in New Mexico, which, was putting more money in public ed towards these economically disadvantaged students, or they're disadvantaged for other reasons. And I'm just wondering, in other states within their formula, or there some relationship with public ed and funding, whether it's dual credit, whether it's following these disadvantaged students all the way through into higher ed, not just getting them to graduate from public schools, but to get them better prepared for community college for 4 years. So if there's any models or anything that you might be able to find or that you know of, because there's a lot of money going to our public schools under Martinez-Yazzie. Not all of it, I think, is they're able to use it all, but I still think you're going to graduate those kids, especially economic development, which is the largest percentage of the population, and then they're not ready to go. And so ready to go to college from there. So I just, didn't know if there's any models or examples to try to tie the public ed better into higher ed when it comes to funding formulas. That's a loaded question, but if you know anything off the top of your head, or something we could think about. And I know David, Abby, you're on. I've talked to you about this. Is maybe I just think that's where we're seeing a problem in our enrollments and our success of students too. Is that cohort?
That's there's no doubt, right, that inputs matter for outputs in higher education, and it is a complex thing, Mark, as you noted. And one thing that there's a much longer history of research within K-12 on the role of funding on outcomes and the appropriate design of formula and the like, and they've advanced to a notion of essentially trying to quantify what does it cost to successfully graduate different types of students, and designing formula. And these are adequacy-based formula, right? And found really good outcomes for approaching it that way. We're not at that point in higher ed. It's a more complex question of all, what does an institution need to fulfill its mission? But what we, and what we're finding is that there is a movement, and this is kind of outside the formula, right, to better connect the expectations post-secondary ed has of an incoming student relative to the expectations that the high school have of their graduating students. And the more we can align those, the better. When it comes to the formula for funding at post-secondary, frankly, we have to deal with the world as it is now, right? And so once a student is admitted, they're admitted, right? And the college then, quote, and this is not the right word, but owns them. Their preparedness, their lack of preparedness now is the problem of the college, right? And whether they're coming in with a history of, of being raised in a low-income family in a rural area, we need to understand and serve them properly, and getting to taking steps towards a funding formula that recognizes some of the challenges that are unique to different students, I think is probably a good first step, all the while working on those larger, longer term issues that Mark highlighted.
And just how you ended that is what I think we need to really consider in this formula is that, because you're right, we do own that student. And in terms of maybe having something in that formula when we're talking about, retaining equity and attainability, is that's the student that I feel like that's that disadvantage, right? So thank you very much for explaining that and finishing up the way you did.
Okay. Oh, I saw Tracy. Is that right? Tracy, you might be on mute.
Which form are we using today, and where's the hand in the race? So thank you. So I'm filling in for Dr. Becky Rowley. So and I represent Central New Mexico Community College. It's one of the large independents. And I appreciate Dr. Anderson's or President Anderson's comments about how the principles are connected and should reflect the state goals for these objectives. And so I have two questions, and because I'm filling in, I don't know where this fits in the short-term, long-term discussion that this committee's having, but I'd ask what the state goals are for equity and attainability. And I don't want to jump to the next principle, but I'd also say for the next principle related to high demand and I guess high reward discipline. So what are those state goals? How will those be developed? And then how will they vary? So I'm going to assume that they will vary based on the sector, because attainability and accessibility at a 4-year R1 is different than a open access 2-year institution. So I want to make sure that we're connected, or the formula connects to, again, what the state wants to, what the goals are, because just doing better, I don't think gets us to where we want to be as a target, just doing better. So how is that part of this conversation? Thank you. And thank you for revisiting the topic. If you're revisiting it, I appreciate that.
So, David, I think this one's more geared towards me. President Hartzler, thank you so much for bringing that up. At this point in time, I know the governor and the legislature have a leadership meeting next week, and they are going to discuss what's the overall vision going into this legislative session. What do we want to accomplish? And I think that will be a very telling point for us to know what is that statewide vision from both the executive and the legislative branch, and how does that apply to the New Mexico higher education formula. So I don't have the response right now. A lot of conversations happening with the executive and legislative branch from what I'm understanding. And I think that's something that we can definitely address in the next meeting to have that statewide goal. What and how does that encompass our funding formula, and how will we reach that? I can tell you now, I know workforce is a great component of that. We're going to touch on that not only in our principles, but also in our short-term goals. Another principle is making sure we're supporting our economic development sector through research as well, and what industries are coming to New Mexico. So those are some of the baselines I know they're working with, but we'll have a clear vision at our next meeting. So thank you for bringing it up. David, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, That's great.
And Director Abby, I saw that your hand was up earlier. Did you still want to make a comment?
Not yet. I guess I'll have some comments after we go through all these goals. Go ahead.
The principles? Okay.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands, and I want to be aware of time so that we can leave plenty for the short and long-term goals. So the next principle is encourage attainment in high demand and high reward disciplines. And this is another kind of principle. It's a difficult one to discuss without immediately jumping to measures and data, which we'll get to later. I'll just point out that there is a movement and a trend towards looking at completions within different disciplines or occupational fields. I believe there was some recent research out of the Informed States group on the effect of including such measures, and maybe Dustin and I can try to dig that up for you all. I would say this is important, and I think high reward disciplines is, you may want to, once we get to the measures point, break it down to high reward credentials. And one piece of research that we've found in a number of states is that institutions oftentimes respond to completions-based performance funding by ramping up short-term certificates because they're low cost, they're easy to ramp up. But we find that there is huge variance in their quality, and that many of them leave students worse off than if they had just stopped it with a high school diploma. So just be cognizant of that. Of course, there's the bigger question of the larger state workforce and economic goals, and you want to align to those. So we're seeing a lot of employment demand in these certain areas. You might want to reward credentials in those areas. But anyways, this is becoming a more common principle. Of course, you have to make sure you have the data to be able to appropriately have a measure and reward it. But I'll stop there, see if Secretary, if you had anything you wanted to add on this.
Yeah, and I just want to add, maybe this is something that we move to the short-term goal discussion, but it is mentioned in there as well, and I just wanted to note that. Any other comments before we move on to, I see Mark.
I just appreciate, so this is on the second principle, correct? This is on.
Yes.
Okay, and so the one thing I just, in terms of when I see the high reward disciplines, and I heard your statement in terms of that we got to be careful that it doesn't backfire on the student, or we don't make it, they're not in a worse situation they were in, which is with a GED or with a high school diploma. So I just think this formula in the past you've seen where I think it's possible where we can create as an institution a high demand discipline or a high reward discipline that necessarily may not be something that the workforce is demanding. And so in formulas, I think it's just important that we try to protect the integrity of the formula, and that we're not out there creating a bunch of degrees or certificates that really aren't helpful for the student. And to me, that has to tie into this in terms of that accountability with this principle.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I've found in other states, it's a far more complex and difficult thing to complete well than governors and legislators often think. And so, the data properly assessed, you'll find that some credentials have a lower return early on, but then catch up and surpass other ones later on. And that's particularly true in the liberal arts. Over a lifetime, they're some of the best credentials, but in the short run, you'll find some of the more STEM ones have a more immediate return, but then the growth is slower over in later years. Anyways, that's more of a measurement question. We're going to have to carefully assess your data and your ability to properly document this. And it's not that easy. It can be done. You run into some issues. Often the research universities are more concerned about this because their graduates tend to go to graduate school more frequently, and they often are on a national job market, not a state job market. And so there can be some data constraints there, some things to think about. But I'll pause because I see Kathy has her hand up.
And real quick, before we go to Kathy, I did see Dr. Shepard, President Shepard had his hand up first. So President Shepard, and then we'll jump over to you, Kathy, if that's okay.
Either way would have been fine. I want to go back to a point that was made about equity, because as we go through creating and focusing on economic development, if we fail to understand the type of populations that we're serving, as in the predominantly Hispanic populations, the African American populations, and the Native American populations, our goals can actually lead us toward more of the Anglo populations. And the success rates would be favored toward those institutions that have predominantly more white students or affluent students than some of those other ethnicities that I mentioned. And I don't think that can be overstated too much, given the type of state that we have and the impoverished nature of our state. And within that, of course, non-ethnic would be first generation, which oftentimes is correlated with ethnic. But as we look at our goals and as we look at our measurements, I think understanding our baseline is very, very important, because otherwise we could create a situation where the funding formula benefits a certain class of people and thereby a certain type of institution.
I really appreciate the emphasis you put on that. You could imagine that rewarding completions, even rewarding, workforce outcomes could exacerbate inequalities. We know that white upper class students often are rewarded more generously in the job market, find employment more easily, and get paid more. Likewise, you have to be concerned about gender differences in workforce outcomes, where frankly, our public service and some portions of our healthcare areas that pay less are predominant. You find an overrepresentation of women in those areas. So really complex, a lot of equity questions that have to be addressed. I believe there are ways of doing that through bonuses, equity metrics, and the like that can help us avoid some of those negative outcomes that can come with rewarding performance. Kathy.
Thank you. I want to touch on the second bullet and think through how we define high demand. I really appreciated Secretary Rodriguez's comment around, the planning that is upcoming as to how we tie and correlate and relate to the work of the Economic Development Department in our state. It's well known that we have an economy in New Mexico that's very public sector focused, and we have this robust oil and gas industry, but we struggle to get traction around substantial efforts to really diversify our economy, particularly in private sector growth in various areas. And so we get into this chicken and egg conversation that leads us down a path of perceptions about brain drain. And I want us to really think that through and be intentional in saying we might be creating high demand programs that are prospective in nature. the demand might not be immediate. It might not be in our community immediately, but if it ties to something that we hope to cultivate and grow, that's really important. And in the short run, we may see students graduate from programs at all levels who ultimately take jobs in other states. But if we maintain our strong alumni networks, then as those positions do come to New Mexico, we can attract those individuals back. So I just want to be really careful and thoughtful about how we define high demand.
Kathy, what I really loved about what you said is the prospective nature, right? Of not only addressing our immediate needs, but being thoughtful of what we need in the future. I think the Economic Development Department's strategic plan is really going to hit on some of those industries that we're going to see published later this fall. So thank you for that point, because I think that is integral to this conversation.
Secretary Rodriguez, I don't see any other hands up. Anyone in your queue?
No one in my queue. Thank you.
So the third principle is use clearly defined, currently available data. And then in parentheses, and identify short and long-term data changes. And so obviously you can only measure what you have data for. And so a careful assessment of what data we have and how those data connect to the components of the formula that we want to include will be critical. That said, also keeping in mind a more longer term perspective as to what we might be able to do in the future if we collect the appropriate data, I think is a very good approach.
Thank you, David, for introducing this principle. I did have a great conversation with one of my colleagues about the types of data we're collecting and what it is demonstrating to us. And I do recognize that some of the data we're collecting, we need to be better stewards of that data and how that data is collected, but also simplified, right? And one of them is transfer. I think we all know transfer is something we need to address. I'll be touching on that in some of my goals in the future presentation here, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Data is an integral piece, but how we're collecting that data is equally important, and how we're showing that data to show what we're trying to demonstrate is just as important as the full picture. So we talk about momentum points, and that's the most reliable measure of transfer we have right now, but how can we take that a step further to show what we need to show that movement in the higher education sector that's accurate of our student populations? All right, any comments on this part? I see President Hartzler.
I'd ask the question about the longitudinal data study, and it somewhat refers back to Mark Saavedra's comments about K-12. But I also want to touch on the high demand. There's an element about information coming to us. How do we track really individual student, track's not the right word. How do we really show progress among our students who are coming to us and those who are leaving for workforce? So I think what you touched on here are important points, clearly defined, available data. I want to make sure we're also focused on, and how do we know we're successful? And often that's trend data, and it's, and particularly as we talk about work, don't want to say how do we know it's high demand? So there are external sources, I guess there are external data sources that it would be helpful in this process to identify as helping us as an institution or even the state identify what benchmarks we want to look at or guideposts. And that could be industry leaders with EDD, right? Or the Economic Development Department. It really could be broader than this. So I think what you touched on seems to be very internal, right? HED data we collect here, but what are the other sources that we want to be inclusive of and thoughtful of as we talk about equity, as we talk about high demand or high value, because ultimately that's probably how we're going to be measured. And I've certainly heard that from legislators, at least on the workforce side.
Thank you, President Hartzler. You know who's been doing a process that's really been fantastic at their institution on collecting the data and showing it long term is Doña Ana Community College. President Torres is on here, but she's been demonstrating that. So what happens to her students through the system, but outside of the system as well. And that I think could be a really good marker of what we shoot for. And then you're absolutely right. How is this going to be integrated into the longitudinal data system that the state is looking into? So thank you for those points. David, do you have anything to add to that piece?
Yeah, and one thing that we're seeing, a recent, almost, I think we could even call it a trend, is that states partnering with the U.S. Census Bureau to use their micro data, the individual data, which allows for really cool connections between their student data systems and then being able to track the workforce outcomes of their students across the country, which is really neat. I mean, obviously we would want them all to stay within New Mexico, right? But we recognize that your colleges and universities do an excellent job preparing your students, and therefore they're attractive all over the country. But my point is not necessarily that that's a partnership you absolutely need to engage in, and maybe you already have those conversations. But just to reinforce the point that President Hartzler was making, which is there are a lot of data sources out there, and thinking critically about those that you want to use to supplement your internal data systems is probably a good idea.
Mark Saavedra.
I just want to thank President Hartzler for making that, simplifying, my comment in terms of that. I mean, that's the equity issue, is when you have 65% of disadvantaged students, then you have remedial students. It's important that we know when we say we own the student, once we admit them, that what type of student are we admitting. And so I do think there's a lot of support for looking at this underserved population of students, this different dynamic, whether you have students at UN, Tech, and State that are having to test in, and then their GPA is considered, and then you have ENMU is a little different than you have the other comprehensive, and you have your 2 years. So I just think we do have data with the public ed department, and then in this state, the Martinez-Yazzie has really highlighted a lot of that. And so I just hope we consider that there's some way, this is more for us state, more for the secretary, for LC and the institutions, and DFA I've been saying this for a couple of sessions now, is there's a way that we can try to tie that Martinez-Yazzie data funding. And like you said, David, you've seen this more outside the formula in other states. I think that's more what I'm saying. But if we do develop a measure for an underserved population, I think we definitely can start with those cohorts in the public ed data that's readily available. So thank you, President Hartzler. Thanks, David. Thanks, Secretary.
Thank you, Mark. And then the census partnership that David had mentioned, I just want to let you know, and Mark C put in the chat that our agency is engaging with the Census Bureau on some of that work, and we're really excited to see that progression as it moves forward.
Excellent. All right, so the final principle is maintain clarity, simplicity, and stability. And I think any organization that does work in this area and makes recommendations would include this one on their list. Instability in a funding formula makes it impossible for colleges and universities to engage in the kind of policy and practice change that is required. And we often see delayed effects of a funding formula because it does take time for a college and university to change their practices, for the department to implement new policies, et cetera. And then these to take hold, impact students, and show up in their outcomes. Simplicity and clarity are also two principles that I think most organizations make recommendations around. We find that really complex formula makes it really difficult for university and college leadership to really identify what they need to do in response to a formula and kind of waters down its overall potential effect. It can be really hard to guard clarity and simplicity because every college recognizes that they're quite unique. And so they want metrics that will be unique to them and benefit them. And that's not entirely inappropriate. There has to be some level of recognition of the differences in missions of different institutions and sectors. But at the same time, if it's too complex, you basically end up with a base plus approach where the formula is meaningless. So finding that sweet spot of recognizing different types of demographics serve different institutional missions while avoiding too complex of a funding formula is something that's going to take some effort and some kind of united focus on it. Otherwise, it's really easy to end up with a really complex formula.
All right. Before we dive into the short-term and long-term goals, do we have any comments related to this principle? All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead. Thank you, David, for leading this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and begin to share my screen so I can dive into the next presentation.
Madam Secretary, I think David Abbey wants to say something.
Yeah, go ahead, Director Abbey.
What was the third principle?
It is use clearly defined and currently available data.
Okay. All right. Can I make a comment, Madam Chair, before we go on?
Go ahead, Director. And I did see Mark had a comment. We did share the policy brief with Shio prior to diving into this working group earlier. Go ahead.
I think a challenge, and it might relate to the fourth point about stability, but it's how do you make a transition from the old funding methodology to a new one? And if there are any principles about that. Because in fact, in New Mexico, if we have probably one of the biggest problems with our formula is that we've always had a base plus. And so we started out, whatever funding we had once carried forward and only evolved as we funded new amounts or shaved the base. And so, and it also, I suppose it relates to the first one about equity, because you talked about equity in terms of cost of educating students with different needs. But what about what's your experience, David, with a base plus formula? You know, how do transitions happen in an equitable way without creating instability? Because
that's a really good question. One common approach. Well, there's two. Okay, let me slow down because I keep adding approaches as I talk. So let's. I think there's three common approaches. One is they implement the formula, but do a hold harmless. So they guarantee that you can be rewarded but not punished, right? So that you will not go below last year's appropriation or say a certain percentage above last year's appropriation, right? So let's say absent the formula, you would have gotten this much, right? You're guaranteed to get that much. You can do better, right? Or a second approach is they ease into it. And so it'll only amount for this percentage of funding in year one, this larger percentage in year two, this percentage in year three, and then wherever you ultimately want to be in year four, right? 100%, 50%, or whatever of your funding will be determined by the formula. The third is just to say we're doing it, and you go all in year one, and you let it take full effect in year one with no hold harmless, no easing in. And there's reasons and theory behind all three approaches. But I think there appears, I don't know that we have any empirical research to justify whether one is better than the other. I would say that it seems that most organizations that consult in this area and most states are going with one of the first two, either a hold harmless or an onboarding process is the approaches they like the most.
So I want to follow up if I can on your first principle, focus on equity and inclusion. What about equity? How do you measure equity among institutions? Not equity about cost of serving different kinds of students, but equity among institutions. Obviously, a simple-minded way to do it, and I'm not sure there's a better one, is dollars per student.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got big variations in dollars per student. I've got some background in tax policy, and we always talk in tax policy about treating people the same who are similar. The tax rates and tax breaks are similar for people in similar circumstances. And we don't, so we might look at funding per student, and we struggled with big disparities in funding per student that has led the legislature to fund non-formula adjustments to narrow those gaps. But it's been pretty small, and mostly it's been neglected. So I just, you know, we want to agree on some principles that we think allow us to go forward, but I think that it's a real challenge to figure out. I agree with, I mean, I guess we historically have implemented close to item one that you said, hold harmless with no base shave. And there were some base shaves proposed, but in general, they were pretty minor. So, you know, over time, some amount of funding has been implemented as we grow, but we're still left with pretty significant. So anyway, I think my point is we could agree on all these principles, but we also need to agree on how to deal with inequities in funding per student that we start with. And here, I mean, everybody said that this formula dates to 2010, but it really dates more like 2002 or 3. It was a base plus formula in 2002 or 3. And much of the funding we have today still reflects whatever it was then.
That's such an important point, David, or Director Abby. I so appreciate you bringing it up. And you know, so I used to be an academic researcher studying performance funding, and my early research raised lots of questions about its viability as just a completions-based approach, that it wasn't increasing completions, and there were some real equity questions and concerns. And one of the big things I've brought up is that when you implement a new performance funding program, it's set on top of whatever funding existed in the previous decades, right? And they're not fair starting points. And the research since mine has shown that highly resourced institutions then do better. It's like, duh, right? They come in and they take advantage of the inequity of the previous approaches, and then those inequities between institutions are exacerbated by the performance funding. Makes complete sense, right? If you have more resources, you'll do better. And so your question of looking at equity between institutions is something we definitely recommend. And starting with dollars per student makes sense, but it's not where it should end, because we know that a research university's mission demands a lot of money, frankly, right? Upper junior, senior year, fifth year students cost more to educate, smaller classrooms, there's the whole research enterprise, et cetera. And so you need to zero down on education dollars per student and then make an allowance for type of degrees that are offered. And then I think it's reasonable to assume that students who come in facing historic barriers, structural barriers, may cost more to educate appropriately. This goes back to what Mark and I were talking about. You have to serve the students you get, and to properly serve them, we shouldn't think that it costs the same amount for every demographic of student. And so that's where it gets a little more complex, right? But it's worth considering those things, and then thinking about how you can account for them in your design of your funding formula. And there are ways of doing that through bonuses and metrics.
Okay. I have one last question, if it's okay, Madam Secretary. So what are there any principles that it could apply to tuition policy in funding formula? How does tuition factor into this discussion?
Well, oh, go ahead, David.
We haven't seen metrics related to tuition, but understanding tuition as a revenue source is important, right? I mean, from the state's perspective, they most directly address funding and funding equity as far as the state appropriations per student, recognizing, of course, that there's the alternative revenue stream of tuition and local funding. That's the thing. As complex as K-12 is, K-12 finance is so much easier than higher ed finance. It just gets so complex so quickly. I'm sorry, Secretary Rodriguez.
No, my answer was along the same lines as yours, David. Thank you. Thank you, Director Abby. I think a lot of this will also be items that we can discuss in our short-term and long-term goals that we have identified. So if you excuse me, I'm a dinosaur and barely know how to use technology, believe it or not, but I finally got it up on my screen. So I'll go ahead and dive into this. But like I stated, I'll be diving into the short-term and long-term goals that were identified from our last discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago. And I'm just trying to see if I'm sharing my full screen. So as we know, performance metrics are extremely important. That's been the whole dialogue and premise of our discussion, but it's most effective when used collaboratively to improve internal processes and student outcomes, which is why all of these stakeholders that are here on this call are here right now to discuss it. I'm extremely grateful for your participation, and I really hope to have this running dialogue as we go through the presentation today. I'm not going to belabor our current funding formula because we know what it is, and we're even going to be discussing it with our subcommittee again next week. But what you'll see on your screen is the current distribution that we had in FY22. And as you are well aware, the current funding formula, David Abbey, you corrected me a little bit, but you said we've been having these discussions really since 2002, really, right? But we've had this newly established one since 2016. And since it's relatively young, we must continue to monitor its efficiency within the system and how it's working. There can be adjustments, and we have done adjustments over time as needed. And that's what's really driving this discussion today that we're going to be having. I'm going to present on both sets of goals first, and then we can open it up to discussion. But the current funding formula is designed to equalize funding among the institutions based on our student outcomes. However, base redistribution combined with historical differences in funding per student, which we just discussed, causes mathematical disadvantages and advantages among the school. And additionally, in New Mexico, we're seeing a gap in our workforce across sectors. A lot of that's also going to be identified in the Economic Development Department's strategic plan. The STEM-H measure that incentivizes STEM and healthcare degrees is a current proxy for our formula as we see it. However, can we broaden the measure from STEM H to a STEM H plus workforce, where additional degrees can be measured and included within the current formula? For example, we have a huge gap in educators and also social workers. So really looking at these high demand fields. Another thing that was brought up last meeting was developing a mechanism to support improving higher education institutions without the redistribution of the base. And then the last point that was brought up by all associations is address the research measure, which is no longer performance-based within our formula. Now, I'm going to dive into the long-term goals because I think we need to discuss what is higher ed looking at as far as our short-term and long-term is concerned. Do we need to switch any of those? That's probably something that we do in our discussion. So I'll go ahead and move on. Now, long-term, the distribution of dual credit course completions in the formula does not sufficiently reimburse higher education institutions for the cost of delivery, and we recognize that. As a matter of fact, last year alone, I believe in the ING, it was less than or around 600,000, and then at PED, they received $1.5 million for materials related to dual credit, but that was it. We know to really fund dual credit, we're talking about millions of dollars to ensure that institutions are considered when they are doing dual credit at their schools. The other thing is the weighting tables in the formula are based on historical and outdated cost of instructional delivery. This has been mentioned that we really need to deep dive into this and see how these matrices are really incorporated now in current times. Another thing is momentum points are typically used to track the movement of a student through the higher education system across the state. However, we can look to find a more simple way to track student movement and transfer in the future, which can also be a long-term goal. And then last but certainly not least, and President Shepard touched on this today a little bit, but the at-risk measure identifies students based on Pell Grant eligibility and the student's expected family contribution. Now, the formula began periodic increases of the expected family contribution threshold in FY20, but there's other risk factors with students that we can also know of, such as first-generation college students, students that also have childcare needs, and other factors will have to require enhanced data collection at student intake when it's submitted to our agency. And that's something that I think we can define as a long-term goal and figure out how we incorporate that in the future. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and really dive into a conversation on these long-term and short-term goals and see where we want to go from here, and then how our technical group can start to put these into the formula and see how they'll look in New Mexico. And Dr. Rommel and Mark Chisholm, feel free to help me in this conversation as we move forward. Are there any, so this is fun. Are there anything in the short-term goals that we felt like something that we cannot do right now within the coming month or get accomplished? Or what sort of considerations do we really need to take into account? Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just on the weighting part, I do think that will be need to be a thoughtful process. So
the weighting in terms of long-term goals, right, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just saying, because I think then, I mean, I'd like to hear from everyone else, but I just think the weighting may be something that could be ambitious for short term, maybe not, but it's just something just to think about. That's all.
I think I agree with you. Weighting is too ambitious that's ambitious for short term, and that's why we have it in the long term. But it was something mentioned multiple times in our last meeting that we need to revisit. So I agree, definitely a long-term goal, not short term.
I misread them. Thank you, Stephanie.
I must have scared you then.
No, I just think I just it is important, so I'm happy it's on there. I had taken my eye off of it, so thank you.
You're welcome. Director Abby, please.
So I want to appeal for the short-term goals, adding 2 items. One is really increasing the weights for at-risk students. We've talked a lot about equity. It is so important, and we know our outcomes aren't adequate And I don't know that increasing the weights is, if it was adding a new measure, it could be hard, but if it's increasing the weights, and I guess I would just challenge the technical group to look at it. If they determine it's impossible, fair enough. But let's try, because I think, it's obviously so important for us. I think we're losing ground on the achievement gap in New Mexico. I'm pretty sure we are. And second, I've talked about this before, and I don't think it's that hard, but to increase the weights for outcomes that are the product of collaboration. In other words, if somebody got a degree where NMSU and UNM combined to produce a degree in a medical field, 2 years at, or community college, we want to incentivize that articulation. And I don't think that's that hard either. I mean, I don't know how hard it is, but I think it's worth a try. And work has been done before. I mentioned that Bill Taylor, who was the dean at Highlands, worked on that before for the funding formula group. And if we could revisit that, it might be a starting point. And again, just because we set it as a short-term goal, it's saying, let's try. And if it's not achievable, then we push it back. It doesn't mean we failed if we haven't been able to achieve one of these things. But I think it might be attainable, and I think it's important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Director Abby. Dr. Rommel, do you have anything in response to that? Because that's going to be your group who will be looking at that.
So that's something I would want to explore with Mark Chisholm and the rest of the colleagues. Is what would probably involve would be, from a technical perspective, flagging a student that was identifying students that had a momentum that were flagged for momentum points and then achieved an outcome. And that may be a little tricky in terms of, when did they get the outcome? When did they transfer over? A simple proxy would be, did a student transfer as flagged by momentum point, and then did they get a degree? That's a possibility, but I don't think I want to commit to that today until I've had a sidebar with my colleagues.
Just to clarify, by me proposing it as a short-term goal, I'm just proposing the technical group look at these two items and try to see if it's feasible. And if it's not, then we'll carry it forward. But I think there's a lot of expertise that might have a way forward on these.
Thank you, Director Abby. Thank you, Dr. Rommel. We'll definitely consider those in the technical group, and you have members that are in that technical group, Director Abby. All right, I don't know who's next, but I'm going to go ahead and go with President Torres. She's the first one on my screen.
Thank you, Secretary Rodriguez. I had a question. I'm representing Sean Powell, who's our association president. Can you tell me a little bit about what we're thinking short term and long term? And then I have a question following that.
Yeah, so the presentation I just had short term. Let's take a look at this. So you heard Director Abby and his two integrations of things that we should look at, which is the at-risk and then also coordination and collaboration amongst institution, but eliminate the redistribution of the base, add additional workforce measures on top of the existing STEM-H, develop a mechanism to support improving higher ed institutions without redistribution, and address the research measure. Then as far as oh, go ahead.
I misspoke. What I was asking is, in terms of timeframes, what are you thinking?
Oh, timeframes.
Sorry, I was not clear.
I'm awful. As you guys can see, my brain is fried, so I apologize. We're actually going to go through the timeline, President Torres, after this conversation with Director Rommel.
Okay.
But as far as short term, we definitely want to get this done by next month, so we know what we want to integrate into the funding formula. That's an adjustment. And as far as long term, it will be in the interim after the legislative session for us to go ahead and reconvene and start talking about those more intricate details, such as matrices.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
President Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I agree that we should not redistribute the base, but that's very different than equalizing the base. To me, it seems difficult to come up with equal measurements when we have institutions that get different bases for roughly the same population, or even, and I can use Eastern at the very bottom of the university side of it, Western comes up next, and so forth. And I don't mind some variance in base, but when you're asking an institution to run a marathon and you require certain ones to start at the 36-mile mark to get to the finish line and others at the 26-mile mark, and then you want to talk about outcomes and so forth, and then you layer on that particularly your rural institutions oftentimes have some of the most challenging students, both non-traditional, traditional, and so forth. You're not much different than the whole court case of Yazzie versus Martinez in terms of comparing Reserve High School to Albuquerque High School. And right now, I believe we have that, and we've had that for quite some time. And I think that on a short-term side, if you're going to talk about a funding formula, you also have to talk about equity.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard. I see Kathy.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I want to just weigh in and support David Abbey's idea that we have the technical committee at least examine whether there could be some short-term improvement in the definition of at-risk. While we've talked about equity in terms of race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, I'd also just like to put on the table, I'd appreciate it if the technical committee could also look at what's happening with gender equity as well. I mean, there's so much national literature about the rapid decline of males participating in higher education. And I'm just curious whether the technical committee sees the data that would support including males somehow in the definition of at-risk.
Dr. Ramo, is that something that you have a response to, or something you'll take to the technical committee on top of President Shepard's comment?
Absolutely, we could look at gender as a particular risk factor as well. Again, I think it's going to be sitting down and seeing what we really can accomplish in the next, quite frankly, month, to present our recommendation.
I might kick in real quickly. One thing we could look at is, of those students that we've identified with the current at-risk measure, which is basically an income, it's expected family contribution. We never really have looked at the distribution over time by ethnicity and gender of that group of students. And so what we might be able to go back and look over the last 5 or 6 years and see if that distribution has changed in ways that we're concerned about. And if it has, then that would suggest possible ways that we could modify the measure to take into account of those changes. Because I know one thing that Harry has noticed is that the total number of Pell dollars awarded the last few years has dropped, which does support the concept that maybe we are not equitably serving low-income students, or it might mean that the economy in New Mexico has been a lot better than we thought it was. We have fewer students who are needing Pell. That's just probably wildly optimistic, and there's probably not data to support that. So that's something we could look at. And on terms of the collaboration, I think identifying a momentum point student and see if they graduated or not could be very, very complicated. But what we could look at is students who are receiving a credential and then look to see how many credits they got from various institutions and explore whether there would be some way of giving institutions who contributed more than some threshold number of credits for a completer some credit for that. That might be more that we could get done the next month, but we could at least start talking about that. And because long term, I mean, we might be looking at long-term A and long-term B. I mean, we all agree that first generation students would be a really important thing to have, but we might not even have that collected in time for next year. So we might have some long-term things like changing the weighting factors and improving some of the mechanism of the formula that we could get done the next cycle. And things like first generation students might take 2 years before we have all that data. So we could start to have that kind of discussion with the technical committee as well, and kind of order the amount of work that these different ideas would require, or the amount of data collection, because it takes some time to decide to collect new data and then work with the institutions and get them to modify their files they submit to us and collect it all and everything. It just takes time to do that well.
Thank you, Mark. That's a good point about long-term A and long-term B.
And if I may, just to give Secretary of the group some perspective, the current momentum point code as written is about 1,600 lines. So it's not a trivial exercise to just go do a find and replace in the code to make those changes.
President Hartzler.
I appreciate that that there's the discussion around what can be done in 2 to 3 weeks, right? For vetting, validate, I mean, in a month. And so, and what we're talking about, and I really appreciate Director Abby's comments about equity and how we can focus on equity and at risk, and certainly Kathy's points about gender, because certainly as a 2-year institution, I think all of us are looking at that, but certainly we've seen that, and it's been exacerbated in the last number of years. What I'm intrigued by, though, is, we are talking about making funding adjustments for FY23 based on historic data, right? So we're going to rerun data based on some different definitions, which is what we always do. What I want to be really helpful about, and what I think is so helpful with HED's budget request, what the LFC's volume documents are that kind of document some of this process, and what the agency may do as well, is talking about if we make changes for FY23, knowing that it's historical data, we're not changing behavior. We're coming up with a different funding mechanism to recognize where we are today, right? And to help us do better maybe next year as an institution with certain students. Because we're talking about definitional changes, which are really sensitive, it would be I think it's really important to say, if this happens in a couple of weeks and you're able to reconfigure weights, maybe not adjust definitions, but if we adjust definitions, or if the department considers that, my gosh, please put in some documentation and recording that says this is a placeholder, and we really want to look at this further, because I certainly appreciate that in FY12 and 13, we were looking at this before, we said, oh, we're going to come back to this in a year and 2 years and 3, and we never really did. And so we're having these conversations, to a substantive degree. So we're having the conversations now. And so I certainly know that our best intentions are always present. But when we start talking about the definitions, which can be so sensitive, and not that they always have unintended consequences, but I would say they're sensitive, we will look at them. And 2, it's not changing behavior yet, because as David noted, we won't be looking at sort of changed behavior for the next year 2, year 3, year 4, right, as the cohorts come through. If you're looking for institutions to change behavior, so what do you want to incentivize? So I know that's a sort of a loaded statement, but I really appreciate that we're looking at trying to make changes and be responsive at the same time. And I really appreciate the acknowledgement of how there's more work to do, and I think that we're all committed to do that. And so I just want to make sure that if we're going to go to a new version of, I'd say, performance, right, incentivized behavior, what does that look like? And I know that the definitions are really meaningful and impactful, and really motivate and move us as institutions to think about our community and how we serve our students a little bit differently, particularly as our missions are so different. So that's a lot, but.
No, it was a lot, but it's absolutely loud and clear. I think it's very, we do have to pay attention to definitions, and changing them in 2 weeks is maybe not the answer, but doing some adjustments, but looking at the definitions long-term and making sure we're all aware of these definitions, we agree with these definitions, is absolutely critical, President Hartzler. So thank you for that comment. Mark.
Yeah, I just, I thank you, Tracy, for pointing that out. Again, back with Harry, we don't want to rush this, and we don't want to try to fit something in so quickly. So I'm hearing some, we don't want to jam things in, right? Because we feel like we have to. And I know the chair of LFC has been clear that she wants this also to be a very thoughtful process, as well as you said that, Secretary Rodriguez. So I'm saying, no rush, right? Let's get this right. And so I do think that I'm on the side of let's really take this. And back to also Tracy's points is, we do need to think about what we're really trying to accomplish here. Enrollment's been a big factor, big discussion in terms of funding higher education in the state. Also we've implemented legislation without thinking how it's going to impact the formula. The gap year, for example, the 15 credit hour requirement, 12 credit requirements. or when we decided the executive order to take credit hours from 128 to 120. Those are examples. We also had to think about those things going forward in terms of legislation that's enacted that has an impact as well. I think we've learned that, at least I've observed that from all the discussions we've had, and really just appreciative of the LFC's leadership on bringing a lot of those things to our attention over a number of years, not just recently. So I just wanted to make that point. One thing that maybe it's just to look at, and it just may seem too trivial, but this is to Mark Chisholm, is that cohort that's on the PED website that breaks down the type of graduate. Looking at that over so many years and trying to identify if it's possible working with PD, find out exactly where those students are going. Because again, that was highlighted at the LFC in Taos. And so that's something that I know is getting attention. So I'd like to know where those economically challenged students are at. Are they not going to school? Or when they are going to school, how successful are they doing? In all those other cohorts. And I can tell you, I went to Albuquerque High School. And my son's there now. It's a true inner city school. So it has both. You have some of the lowest, poorest, roughest areas in the city, and then you have some of the higher end where you have the university community there. It's a really huge blend, right? And so we have all these dynamics within these high schools as well, not just within the area of the state. And then finally with research, Stephanie, I think no matter what, that research question, thank you for putting that on there in terms of that, looking at that as a measure. And then I think I'd really just, again, push for a research president to be on this group, or at least having research be made, at least research presidents or someone. I know Ricardo will be on the technical, but being involved with helping to develop that as well along the way. So just wanted to put that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I know this isn't an immediate answer to what you just brought up about where are high schoolers going, but the longitudinal data system, it's our hope that we can start to really monitor that in coordination and collaboration with our school districts and our colleges and universities to start tracking where those students are going upon the completion of their programs.
We do have data on what students from what high schools are going to our colleges, because we do collect high school graduation. But what we don't currently have is how many high school graduates from that high school were available to go on to college. We get graduation rates, but I'm having difficulty getting the actual number of graduates. And then, of course, we don't have the demographic information about that student. We know their gender and their sex, but we don't. And if they have a FAFSA, we know their income, but we don't really have a picture of the academic coursework they took. And so that's where the LDS is going to be really, really important, is to be able to identify students who've had certain kinds of academic success in high school and then how they do when they go on to college and so forth. But good point. We could start looking at least where which high schools have students going where. That's an interesting analysis. We used to do that report, big matrix. Maybe we'll update that again, but I think that's outside the formula for right now, but something that probably should be thought about as a long-term incentive to make sure we're serving our high school graduates as well as the adult population of the state.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're talking about time now, right? We want to make sure that we can accomplish some of our goals, but also look to the future and what we want to do long term. So with that, Dr. Rama, I'm going to pull up your timeline now of what the technical group is going to do, and I'll go ahead and have you jump in.
Thank you, Secretary. So what we have here is a timeline. It is not set in stone. It is probably going to be somewhat fluid, but I kind of wanted to articulate what we're going to try to accomplish over the next month to 6 weeks. Our hard deadline being November 1 to submit an ING recommendation. Right now, we are in the institutional review of the raw data phase. The student credit hour and dual credit hours have been analyzed by the institution and verified. I just sent out the raw award data yesterday. We're hoping to get those corrections by next week. I think that's the 23rd, but we can go to Friday the 24th. Again, fluid. I will be generating a sheet of some proposed workforce SIP codes to add for exploration in the formula. As was mentioned, we may want to look at education, possibly some other workforce measures. I want to send those to the technical group as a separate spreadsheet next week, so we can begin to have that discussion. And then no later than the 25th, we will have the first draft of the ING formula out to the technical group to start working with and running scenarios. It does say no at-risk data, and I should be clear about that. What that means is we won't have the at-risk student file updated for the with the FY21 data. We'll put last year's data in as a dummy variable. Because it's based on 3-year rolling averages, it will not make a significant change when we update that data when it's available. I would like to schedule our scenario review for the technical group the week of the 1st through the 8th, date and time to be determined. Then we'll have a second draft of the formula with all of the data completed on the 1st. That way we'll have all the data updated and we'll know what the numbers are going to look like as the dust settles and we explore scenarios. The technical group, we want to finalize our recommendations, and I know that every member of the group will be working with their respective bosses and keeping this steering committee up to date through this period. But I would like to have our recommendations as a technical group completed by the 8th of October, and then have this steering committee review and endorse, or at least review it by the 15th. If this steering committee determines, there'll probably be another meeting that we want to make any additional changes, or we decide there are things we want to put back on or take off, we'll have to run that in the next couple of weeks. I want to have that, any finalized changes done by the 28th, and then again, re-blessed by the steering committee. And then November 1 is, of course, our deadline for submitting our formula recommendation to our colleagues at DFA and LFC. So that's an ambitious timeline, but I think because of what we've done, what this group has done in identifying what can be done in the short and versus the long term, I think it's completely doable, and I think we're going to have a really good product. So that's my proposal. Do you have any questions?
Sorry. Or Harry, can we just get a copy of this or a list of this, or like on an email, so we can send it out to our presidents, or kind of an idea of what the game plan is?
Ty, this is absolutely, Ty. We actually have a website where we update all of our links, presentations, meeting minutes, and recordings. I'll not only email it to you, but also an update on that website that has all this information as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And then I just want to reiterate what Dr. Rommel said. Everything that the technical group puts together will be run past this committee for us to review and put some inputs into it and change it as we see fit. Kathy, go ahead.
Thanks. Have you identified the members of the technical group yet?
We have, I think, yes, we have, based on your suggestion, Ed Desplas. And of course yourself, Kathy, as I think we need a representative from the from ACC, Ty.
Yeah, Harry, I thought that I thought that I had sent you that recommendation. I do have someone. He's from Roswell, Todd Decay. We're going to put him on there, and then also, yeah, and then also I'd like to be on there, like even as an advisory or just to listen in. I don't want to overdo it for you guys, but
I believe I think it's appropriate that the association heads are at the minimum peripherally involved with the technical committee work. So
okay.
And what we'll do is we'll set an update to the group in addition to the presentation with the timeline of who those members are. But we were very cautious to ensure that we had representation from your sectors. And we even have partners from LFC and DFA in our technical group as well. All right. Any other questions, comments that we need to discuss today? All right, team. We have a lot of homework at HED. We'll be engaging you all and updating you all via email on the things that were requested today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or ideas, you know where to find me. I have been listening to you all as you guys give me calls and feedback, and I truly appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. And please ensure that you're touching base with your technical committee member to ensure that your representation is at the table at all times as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.